recording
ask.
these and I stick them on YouTube
Good.
for people to
Uh,
take it. So, all right.
yeah. Well, it was okay. So this thing is in this edition. It's called a debate.
Mhm.
Its title is a debate. And I don't want to argue with people who have to put together programs for meetings or editions. Collections of essays. They have to say what they have to say. But this is obviously not a debate. Okay. Gadamer at the beginning says it's a joint discussion. Okay.
Yep.
And it had the feel of a joint discussion. Okay. I mean, they clearly agreed about an enormous amount. Their style was a little different, but they clearly fundamentally agreed about it just an enormous amount. Okay. But the part of it that I thought was that fascinated me as I'm listening to them is on page 236 of this edition, where we're in the discussion. Okay.
Yep.
And you can see from the first kinds of questions that they go and somebody asks a question and they both agree with each other.
Mhm.
Somebody else asks a question and they both agree with each other. And finally, this was too much for my interpretation. This was too much for Gadamer. The
Okay.
conversation is not about agreeing.
Yeah.
And so he just couldn't stand it. And he got up. I'm exaggerating. This is
Yeah.
me. I'm exaggerating here. But he got up and said, well, I want to ask a question,
I see.
you know, on a point which has never been quite clear to me.
Mm-hmm.
So now he's going to say, there's something you say I'm not sure I understand or agree with. It's not
Yeah.
just this, oh, we're just going to have this love feast. And then he asks this question. He says, I don't see how this works. I don't see how this can be brought together. I don't see how you can do this. How can you make this work? I don't get it. And Ricoeur then replies, it replies kind of beautifully, but you can see right away he's in a very serious mode. Let us take a concrete example of a structural analysis to show how it redirects. I mean, he tries to answer, okay, and he goes on at some length. It's a beautiful answer. And Gadamer at the end says, well, I thank you for your full agreement. But I still wonder how you reintegrate the Freudian thing in that. I cannot bring this together.
Yeah.
I mean, he would not accept mere agreement.
Right.
There's no point in talking to people when you completely agree with them.
Yeah.
And so he wanted some kind of dialogue to take
Yeah.
place where you search for some
Mhm.
common ground where you didn't know you had it.
Right.
It wasn't something already you were in possession of. I just think that's very Gadamer.
Yeah.
You know,
That's great.
it's so I thought, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And he's very gracious and genial. I don't want to say he's confrontational or belligerent or something like that. Not at all. Not at all. He's very polite. I mean, Gadamer was the soul of tact and kindness and
Right.
all that kind of thing. But he was not going to let this occasion slip by.
Right. So, Eric, does that answer your question? Eric put in the chat. Did it feel
Yeah,
like they
yeah,
were at odds?
Well,
yeah,
that's just my
yeah,
perspective. That's just my perspective. I don't know if
yeah.
other
That's what I
people.
was. That's what I was going to bring up next because
Okay.
after that, on page 238, Kerr does end up saying that psychoanalysis is for the couch, not for texts.
He does.
Yeah.
So he ends up still agreeing with Gadamer, even though he's trying to
Yeah.
illustrate that it's possible to integrate psychoanalytic moment as an explanatory step in the interpretive process.
Yes.
Whereas Gadamer is kind of asking for a synthesis, whereas Ricoeur's kind of saying it's not a synthesis, it's a step in the process.
Yeah. Well, it's a big question for Gadamer at the bottom of 239. I thought this is a very short answer that he gives to a question, but they're talking about reintegration. How do you reintegrate this suspicious hermeneutic, its interpretation, with social life? This is not a question concerning principles. It's an empirical question. We have to try and see. And I would say that the last point is a question even of social responsibility, because what this goes back to is what he says on 220 when he's, if I can find it here, 221, 220. where he talks about being solidarity, a point of solidarity that we need. We're trying to connect with people. Okay, and I think that's common to all human beings. We have as human beings, we need to find solidarity. Solidarity is a word that repeats in this essay, in his comments. And hermeneutics is about solidarity. And we can't have a situation where there is in principle not a possibility of solidarity, which means his real challenger is not Ricoeur or even psychoanalysis, it's Blanchot. Blanchot in the book called The Infinite Conversation, his whole point is the impossibility of dialogue.
Yeah.
And that's a tough one to face. That's a difficult challenge. Okay, I'm talking too much.
I want to ask one more question just because you were there. So I understand that most of Gadamer's talks, especially his later talks, he wasn't reading from a text. He was just talking, right? Maybe he had a note card, but that was the extent of it. And that's how it reads to me, as quasi extemporaneous. He has these stories. He has an idea of what points he's going to make, and that's the way it was.
I saw him do that at Iowa. So he was giving a series of like 9 lectures.
Mm-hmm.
And he was staying, we had him put up in the hotel on campus, the campus hotel. And I went to pick him up to take him to one of the lectures. Mm-hmm. And I found him sitting in his hotel room with a card in front of him, or the back of an envelope. It's just ridiculous. And he was scribbling a few words on it. Mm-hmm. And then he went off and he gave, this perfectly coherent in English, which was not his first language, but his English was, I thought, wonderful. In English, gave this like hour-long lecture.
Yeah.
I think he says in the second paragraph, in the first paragraph, after my short conversation with Professor Kerr about what he would be saying, I think that's the hint.
Yeah.
They got together in the green room. And Gadamer said, well, what are you going to talk about, Paul? And Paul said, well, I'm going to talk about this and that and the other thing. And Ricoeur says, oh, okay, very good, very good. And then he went out and gave this talk,
Okay.
And he proposed the topic,
mm-hmm.
which is a homage to Ricoeur, because Ricoeur had published a book called The Conflict of Interpretations.
Right.
And so he was trying to take up something central to Ricoeur and get it out of it. I think that's, and his mind was just so full that he could spin these things out.
Yeah, great. Does anyone else want to? We have an eyewitness ask anything about what it was like before we start jumping in.
Were you one of the questioners that's recorded here?
I do not remember asking a question. I was
wondering who they were.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't remember because I didn't know everybody at that point. It was really new to me. I was so overawed. I don't think I could have spoken if you had asked me.
Right.
But yeah.
Sure, I could comment.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, David, and everyone. I was at many talks, probably several dozen talks. I took 6 full courses with him.
Right.
I spent hundreds of hours with him, and no, he would comment. I think he always tried to speak extemporaneously, as we would say, like without notes. He never, he would not read anything, and it didn't matter which language. And he would have a text, like he always, like most of the courses I took with him were on Greek philosophy. And he would open up a Greek text and he would translate. He would read the text first in Greek, in ancient Greece. It wasn't bilingual. It was because he never needed that. And then he would give that, and then he would go on, and occasionally he would refer to someone, asked him about Hegel, And I remember he looked at a translation. He says, "I have a hard time recognizing Hegel here." And then they said, "Oh yes, now I see it." And I remember once there was a conference which I missed because I was on the road in a band at that point. But where who's the guy? Alan Bloom. Like it was a big thing on Plato. It was at York University, and all my buddies told me about this when they came back. And they were discussing Plato, and he didn't have a copy of the Republic with him, like his own copy. He said, "Could someone give me a copy of the Republic?" And Alan Bloom handed him a copy of his translation. Gadamer says, "No, Plato, please, Plato." So, but no, he always spoke. Yeah,
Right.
that was his, because he believed that was the right way to do it.
Yeah.
It had to come out, it had to unfold. And this is what dialectic is all about too.
Mm-hmm.
It's like non-predictable. You don't know where it's going to lead.
And I remember him talking in interviews about the value of having a recorder. So people would record his talks.
Yeah.
He'd have them transcribed, and he'd go back and edit them up and touch them up. And right, that's sort of how we have many of the later essays.
Yes. And I did that. I recorded everything.
Yes, I know. I love. You still got them, right?
Some of them have disintegrated. Some of them have been transcribed. It's anyway, we'll talk about that.
Okay. Fair enough.
There are unpublished transcriptions of his lectures at Iowa at the library in Iowa.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Nice.
Maybe it's time for a sabbatical pilgrimage. Eric, did you want to get in here?
Well, I wanted to ask more questions. John, if you want to add too, but of Don, like when when you were saying that there was so much agreement that Gadamer kind of gets up and says, "Well, I want to ask a question," which you're presenting this.
Yeah.
Was it clear that like Ricoeur was deferential to Gadamer, like in the sense that like as somebody who's reading it from outside, just reading their books, right? Like I see Gadamer in the 60s publishing Truth and Method, right? And then Ricoeur starts picking up hermeneutics after Gadamer. And so kind of, I wouldn't say that Ricoeur's a disciple of Gadamer, but yet he's following in Gadamer's footsteps. And so I'm just wondering how they like position themselves on the stage, like just that kind of, what was Ricoeur deferential to him?
I would say, again, this is just my perspective, so don't take this as more than it is. Okay. Because I met Ricoeur on a few occasions, and I went to one of his classes at one time, and I've heard him lecture many times. And Ricoeur is he was such a modest human being. He didn't fill a room exactly. He didn't dominate. Okay. That just wasn't his style. So I wouldn't say he was deferential to Gadamer, but he wasn't sort of pushing his position. The one time, I mean, Gadamer's question to him did spark a response. You could sort of see him. Okay, I'm gonna push it harder now. I'm going to state what I think. But otherwise, he just unfolds these things and puts them there for you. So I wouldn't say deferential, but he's just a very modest person. Doesn't push himself. He's not interested in himself. It's not about him. There's no ego there, I think. He just presents these ideas which are astonishing. I mean, they're so rich and so organized. He's just such a clear mind. I don't know. Maybe Jean Grondin was at
welcome, Jean,
at that meeting.
Don Marshall was at the session, and so we're picking his brain of what it was like to actually see it live.
Yeah.
You didn't happen to be there, were you?
No. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
No, but I have often seen Gadamer and Ricoeur interact with one another. On the 90th birthday, 95th birthday, the 100th birthday anniversary. I saw them in 1976 in Ottawa, where they both attended the Rationality Conference. And some of their exchanges during this conference were recorded, but it was a difficult relationship. I apologize for arriving late. I was attending a birthday party for my granddaughter, who is 4. And for the first time in a year and a half, we could meet outside for a small party for a 4-year-old. So I was there for lunch, and my son invited me. So I apologize for this belated appearance, but
that's a great excuse. You don't have to ever worry
I'm a
about
grandfather,
4-year-old
and I'm a
birthday
very
party.
happy one. But, and I'm sorry I missed what you just said, but it's.
Well, Eric was asking about their relationship and whether Gadamer was deferential to Ricoeur, was Ricoeur deferential to Gadamer? Was
I mean Ricoeur being deferential to Gadamer.
That's what I thought you meant, right? Yeah.
That was more the case. Ricoeur had a lot of respect for Gadamer, and he wrote a lot on Gadamer. Finally, he did classes on Gadamer, but Gadamer never did that. Gadamer never wrote a piece, for instance, on Ricoeur. And I find that, for my part, unfortunate, because he knew that Ricoeur was the second most important figure of hermeneutics in his time. And I would have found it fruitful if, I don't know, Gadamer wrote a narrative in Ricoeur, on metaphor in Ricoeur, on what have you. But my impression was Gadamer always said that he could never discuss with Ricoeur. He was not a man of Gespräch.
Huh.
That was his impression. Ricoeur was for him too Cartesian. You had a givenness, a text, and how do you interpret this text? Oh, you have different methods, you have structuralist methods, you have this and that kind of method. And for Gadamer, that was a bit too Cartesian.
Yeah. Interesting. This is great. This is fantastic. All this background. Wow, fantastic. That makes a lot of sense.
John, could you elaborate more on that? Like, what do you mean? What do you mean that Gadamer would describe him as Cartesian? Like you said that he takes the text as an object. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on that? Gadamer's kind of dismissal of Ricoeur in a way.
Well, I would say, well, I'm sorry if I mean, it's not very polite to arrive late at the meeting and then start discussing with people. But I think a text for Gadamer is never a piece of paper. It's not something that is given objectively and to which you could apply something like a method of analysis. A text is something that springs at you, which is going to spricht an, was going to speak to you. And for Ricoeur, a text is something given. It's something that is objectified, that is independent of its author, and you can apply different methods, structuralist methods among them, to that. And Gadamer says, no, that's not the way, that's not the being of a text. And of course, Gadamer, I don't think he ever read a single line of any structuralist author in his life. I mean, Greimas, who is a god for Ricoeur, is somebody Gadamer probably never read.
Yeah.
Lévi-Strauss, the same thing. I mean, that was absolutely not Gadamer's universe. But it was the universe in which Ricoeur was immersed. I mean, that was the dominant trend in French intellectual circles.
Yeah.
It did not survive Ricoeur either, but that's another issue.
Yeah. It's not because I think I think I recognize the Cartesianism in Ricoeur, and in a sense, that's actually what I prize about him. I mean, it's something that Gadamer doesn't have that. Gadamer just doesn't think that way. And Ricoeur, even here, Ricoeur says, okay, I'm going to discuss the conflict of interpretation. I'm going to start here. I'm going to start with texts. Then I'm going to do the theory of action. Then I'm going to do history. And that's not just 1, 2, 3. It's a dialectical progression. And each of the steps is integrated into the next step. It's just a beautifully constructed kind of architectonic.
That sounds pretty anti-Cartesian to me.
Well, I don't know. But you see it in symbolism of evil already, the way in which the cycles of interpretation of symbols are sort of folded into each other. You see it in the discussion of narrative, in the books on narrative. I just think this is so illuminating in Ricoeur. It's just splendid. But I'm a Gadamerian, I admit. But.
So maybe as a transition to the transcription in front of us,
yeah,
and maybe I think it's related to this. One thing that I wondered, since Gadamer got the first word, was whether he was loading the debate by understanding conflict of interpretation explicitly in a way Ricoeur doesn't. It seems like Gadamer and Ricoeur have different ideas what a conflict of interpretation is. And Gadamer sets it up as the conflict is between traditions that we inherit and become part of and that live on through us, and then the meaning speaks out to us, and sort of a Nietzschean undermining. And that's the big conflict. And Ricoeur seems like he wants to set things up quite differently. Maybe along the lines of, we've got multiple interpretations, we have to have now these conflicts across different interpretations because the text sits in front of us and can be read in different ways. So I was wondering if Gadamer was setting up a criticism of Ricoeur from the start by describing a conflict interpretation in terms that Ricoeur wouldn't recognize or didn't mean when he was talking about conflict of interpretations.
That's why I tried to ask earlier if Ricoeur would understand himself in light of the way that Gadamer would describe him.
Yeah.
Right. And I agree that there's this kind of framing of the topic in a way that seemed alien to Ricoeur.
Yeah, right. Exactly. He immediately says, well, it's not like that. First, we have to look at 4 different ways, and psychoanalysis is such an extreme case. I don't even know why we're talking about that now. And then we have to walk our way to it. And right. But it struck me maybe as also an understanding of Ricoeur and trying to sort of undermine his starting point by adopting the fully, rather than for Ricoeur, it's structuralism versus existentialism. It's the moment versus we need to talk about the structures and the patterns and the universal categories. Gadamer turns to Heidegger and says, interpretation is fundamentally an existential phenomenon. It's about what we are as human beings. And Ricoeur's whole distinctions come up too late, or much later in the process. John.
Yeah, just a little thing here. I think that Gadamer does stress he wants to talk about dialectic, and I don't think Ricoeur has really grasped the nature, really what Gadamer means by dialectic, if I may be so presumptuous to say that, but especially the way that what dialectic means for Plato. And at the end, I got the idea when Ricoeur was talking about homologia, Gadamer would have treated homologia quite differently than Ricoeur does, because for Gadamer, homologia was the point, and I've expressed this before in Plato's dialogue, when the dialectic actually begins. There's a lot of, fooling around and jokes and conflicts and dead ends and rabbit holes. But when this homologia just kind of comes out, and this just almost accidentally in some ways, but that's when Socrates says, "And this we can agree," and then he goes on from there. And it's like in the Phaedo, where there's they talk about the hypothesis. The one hypothesis that they can agree on then you go. And I think Ricoeur kind of saw like homologia as what happens after mediation, is when you get to agreement. And I don't think that's, Gadamer saw the dialectic as an open-ended thing that no one knows where it's going to end up. That's, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Just along those lines, Gadamer stresses everywhere. I mean, in his work, that the really important thing is to come up with the right question. So even an answer, the point of an answer, when he talks about scientific method with Popper, somebody would say, the point is not validation or falsification. What makes great science is coming up with the questions that are fruitful and that open. And so an agreement raises a question. And the point about the agreement is to raise the question, not to stop. You don't stop at the agreement. That's the starting point for the unfolding of the discussion. Yeah.
Eric,
Isn't that what Ricoeur is doing though? He's raising the question, so conflict of interpretations, how do we mediate, right? Because he starts his lecture by saying, understanding is I'm about to make some coffee, that's all. He says, you're not supposed to brood over a situation of conflict, but to try to bridge it, right? On page 223. And so he's got the question, there seems to be these conflicting interpretive paradigms that come to radically different conclusions about the meaning of a text. So how do we address that such that we can preserve their value and not just lobby for one as the only answer, the only interpretation?
Right.
So I think Ricoeur is doing it. He's asking the question and trying to answer it, and then it's almost like they talk past one another after that.
Yeah. I agree with that. I don't want to put it too bluntly or something, but it's as though on the one hand, the conflict of interpretation is one interpretation disagreeing with another in some kind of logical way. What a text means. They're not compatible somehow. And what Gadamer seems to be talking about is a conflict between interpreters. I mean, his issue is he keeps emphasizing that it's a social act. Interpretation is a social act. This process of dialogue is a social process. There's an ethic involved in it. So it's not a matter of I look at this text and it says this about the text, and then I look at this other interpretation that says that about the text, and those two interpretive texts are not compatible. It's that there's a life process going on the part of both of the interlocutors. And even dialogue is not just words. I say words and you say words at me. It's the whole kind of intangible social process of what's going on in our interaction and in our relationship with each other, in our searching for solidarity with each other, for human solidarity with it. And that's why I think he thinks it can't just be left that there are conflicting interpretations, because it would mean ultimately that human beings are not, there is no human solidarity. Human beings can't connect with each other.
Yeah, John, go ahead.
I may. I think that absolutely, and I think Jean Grandin has hit on to there's a real point that of disagreement, a fundamental point between Gadamer and Ricoeur, and they are in a sense talking at cross purposes. And this kind of disagreement, or this split in civilization that is suicidal, that they refer to, this begins with Descartes, and this is what Heidegger and Gadamer were trying to heal. And so I think they haven't really that's why they are talking always a bit at cross purposes, because there is that, excuse me, there is that Heideggerian, or there is that Cartesian thing between them.
John, could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by the Cartesian thing between them?
Well, I think just what Jean Grandin said, and it's the basic. It goes back to what, if we want to elaborate, I guess what Heidegger called the fundamentum inconcussum, which Gadamer agreed with, which was a Heideggerian gloss on Descartes. Descartes never said that, but it's that everything started anew, and there was a split there, and there was a which became clarified and which became apparent in Kant when reason was split between science and then the human sciences and as Gadamer said, and Jean Gardin says the text is an object, it's a thing. Gadamer says it has no meaning in itself. It is not an object in itself. And he didn't mean that just simply in the Kantian sense, but it's not, it's there to speak to us. And I just, I think Jean Grandin explained it quite well. Does that make sense? And so we engage in it. So we get involved in a dialogue with it. So that's where the text becomes fresh dialectic with us, and we do, with that with each other. And it's not, getting to the point of the kernel or the hidden center of the text. Gadamer says, I don't know what that's going to be. Gadamer says there isn't such a thing. Such a thing never did exist.
What if
Really,
I reframed it back to you this way? That in terms of their phenomenologies, Gadamer is aligned with Heidegger and Ricoeur is aligned more with Husserl.
Yeah, very much so.
Would that work in terms of like connecting to this kind of Cartesian element of Ricoeur?
I would say yes. That's
interesting.
And Jean Grandin's nodding his head too. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think so.
Well, there was always in Ricoeur a reservedness towards Heidegger, very obviously. And in the case of Gadamer, it's always the opposite. He will always integrate Heidegger, defend him, and he's a much more Heideggerian thinker than, he did not follow Heidegger in everything, of course, but he's far more Heideggerian than Ricoeur. And Ricoeur, as you see in the first volume of his Philosophy of the Will, understands phenomenology out of Husserl. You describe essences. It's not how Gadamer would describe phenomenology.
Well, I wonder if that has an impact on how they differently define what a text even is. That in the kind of Husserlian influenced hermeneutic, a text would be within the noematic, right? The noesis, noema kind of analysis. And so you've already got this started. And what is it? Derrida has that chapter on Husserl and meaning and what is meaning in Husserl. Whereas Gadamer already working within Heidegger's framework, text is going to be aligned with the, Zuhandenheit, Vorhandenheit, all these categories instead. So like what they not, although they're acting like there's a lot of agreement, they're not really even in agreement on what a text even is.
That may be. I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep speaking. There are many people here, and I really like to hear what they think about this, but I'm a philologist rather than a philosopher, okay? And so when Ricoeur speaks about text, this is on page 225, he speaks about a text as something that's formed and it's autonomous from its author, autonomous from the capacity of understanding of its original audience, autonomous from the process by which it was transmitted in written form to us. Okay, so it has this kind of objectivity that he's describing, and at the bottom of the page he says there's an objectification of discourse in text, which is a kind of natural text. And that seems to me that's his understanding of text. I think with Gadamer, we'd have to look at the text where Gadamer talks about what he calls the eminent text. And the eminent text is objective in a way. I mean, it has its self-substantiality, it's self-standing, but it's the self-standing that brings a truth to expression or gives us access to a truth. He's always interested in the race behind the text, and that's the substance of what's being conveyed. So it seems to me, I don't want to exaggerate, but it seems to me there is kind of a difference. There are a difference of emphasis somehow. Okay.
I might add, if you want, on a historical note, the very first dialogue between Ricoeur and Gadamer took place in 1970, when Ricoeur published a text in the Festschrift for Gadamer's 70th birthday called Hermeneutik und Dialektik. And it's a text of Ricoeur, which is entitled, it's in French, so Gadamer could read it. It's entitled Qu'est-ce qu'un texte? What is a text? And in this text, Ricoeur presents his interpretation of the text as something that is autonomous from the author and that you have to understand through structural analysis. But this is the very first attempt at dialogue between Ricoeur and Gadamer, even if Ricoeur in this text never mentions Gadamer or his philosophy, with which he had a basic familiarity, but this is how it all began. Qu'est-ce qu'un texte, 1970.
Isn't that good? That's good.
And Gadamer never responded, because for him, as you say, that's not what a text is. What a text is, he said, is in his essay on the eminent text and so forth, and that's Gadamer did not recognize himself in this view of the text at all. I mean, that's totally foreign to him, unfortunately.
Right, keep your hand up.
Why did you say unfortunately, John? Why did you?
Because Ricoeur and Gadamer had a lot in common. After you go through structuralism and analytic philosophy and all this stuff in Ricoeur, the conclusions of Ricoeur are very close to Gadamer. He will take up the phronesis in his oneself as another. He will say that text interpretation culminates in an appropriation of meaning, an Eignung, which is exactly what Gadamer says. Both had the same kind of humanist upbringing. Both studied phenomenology, the history of philosophy. Both are very familiar with the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle. I mean, it's the same philosophical culture they both have. And they're very much alike in their conclusion and their outlooks on the basic issues of philosophy. But during their debate, it never came out. And they never really debated, unfortunately. But I would say, on the whole, they were very close philosophically, with some differences of accents, of course. Gadamer more of a Heideggerian, but of course, Gadamer was not 100% Heideggerian. He was Gadamer. I mean, he had his misgivings about Heidegger, and those are misgivings that Ricoeur would have shared. The idea of dialogue, that interpretation as a dialogue, is something that was also close to Ricoeur. Ricoeur always likes to reconcile the opposites. You start with the structuralists, and then you go to phenomenology of religion, and then you put them into dialogue, and out of this dialogue, you'll have a synthesis and so forth. So both believed in the power of dialogue, of language, of both also had a Hegelian streak in them. Both believe in institutions. Institutions are important, the objective spirit and all that. And Gadamer, you also have that in Heidegger, practical wisdom and so forth. That's why I say, unfortunately, they could have a very fruitful discussions on their basic philosophical convictions.
Greg, you want to get in here?
Yeah, this is changing topics maybe a little bit. I had a question about, so Recur, when he's talking about action theory, refers to Davidson's criticisms of Anscombe. And I am not familiar with that part of Davidson, at least, and not with that part of Anscombe either. So I was wondering if anybody had more knowledge of what's going on in that debate. Like, what was Anscombe saying and what was Davidson's critique of it? Because Recur quite clearly took Davidson's side on that, and I thought that might illuminate the position he's trying to defend a little bit. Does anyone have more knowledge of that than I do?
Okay, I tried to research this before our session. I tried to sort of follow all the references so I could say something. But it wasn't clear to me because they seem to be very similar. Both Davidson and Anscombe argue against the idea that there is an intention that operates independently from the action. So you intend to, well, Davidson's example is you tend to write the word action. And it's not like you have a thought in mind, here's my intention, and then the action is just a realization of the intention. For both of them, the intention persists throughout the action because actions take time. So intentions belong to the unfolding of the event of the action in time. As you write the A, C, T, you are realizing an intention through the process. So I could see how that view would affect how you interpreted works of art or texts as being an expression of intention, because there isn't sort of an intention happening behind the work that then you're trying to, the work is just sort of a vehicle through which, hang on just a second. There's trucks going by. This is the downfall sitting outside here.
It's okay.
So we're not, the text or the work of art is not just some sort of medium through which we're going to get to what really matters, which is the intention at the start, right? Then the work is the realization of the intentions as it was carried out in the process. So, but I didn't find anything about Davidson against Anscombe, because the focus of the things I read were about how Davidson was very concerned about the logical form of an expression of an action and how that would fit within his logic of actions. And it didn't. And so the things I read were all talking about how Davidson seems to be talking past Anscombe because he has a different concern than she does. But they both share this idea that intentions aren't things that sort of float around in your head prior to an action, that then actions are trying to realize or not. If that helps.
Just looking at how it's stated in the book, and then I think Recur does talk a little bit about this also, this difference in oneself as another. Mm-hmm. But that, I mean, what he's focused on right here is to what degree do motives have explanatory force? And then in what way does the motive play a role in that explanation? And so that's where he's trying to give his theory of action as analogous to his theory of text, that action, just like words speak, actions speak louder than words sometimes, right? Like he's getting at the precision of that transition. And so that to explain an action is to explain the motive, and to explain the motive is to provide a story.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think I was just thinking of Anscombe's example, and her example is somebody who's pumping water to refill a cistern in a house, but the water is actually poisonous. And then you can describe the actions in 4 different ways. She says they're moving their hand upside down was one, up and down. They're operating a pump, they're refilling a cistern, or they're poisoning the residents. But only one of those captures the intention. The person isn't intending to just move their hand up and down, and it happens to operate a pump at that moment. Nor are they simply, so only one of those has explanatory power. Only the third one, that they're trying to refill the cistern, because they weren't trying to poison. So that might be an important point then, that to appeal to an intention is always to tell a story that you can describe actions in any number of ways. Appealing to the intention is the one that tells a story that explains those actions, organizes them. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah, although I thought I took it that Recur was saying the opposite, that the reason he was agreeing with Davidson over against Anscombe was precisely that it's necessary for intention ascriptions to have explanatory force. Maybe I misread that though. I'm gonna go back and find what page this is on.
It's on page 227.
Right.
To me, it's not the issue of whether motives have explanatory force. It's that for motives to have explanatory force, they must be rendered discursive in this storytelling sense.
Yeah.
So that Anscombe has, like, you can appeal to intentions, but she's psychologizing it in a way that Davidson just makes it discursive, because her needs action to be linguistic to maintain the model of the text in his theory of action.
Okay. But through all these, in Ricoeur, there's this fundamental tension between understanding and explanation. It goes back to Dilthey, right? The question is, are we trying to understand it, or are we trying to explain it? And you can understand Kant, but to explain Kant, you may have to go far beyond anything Kant himself was aware of, right? And that might be also include Nietzschean moments, questions about Kant's psychology, questions about Kant's times, and then the way sort of structuralist ideas might come in as well, questions about class, all these other sorts of things. I think that distinction between understanding and explaining and the dialectic between them is at the heart of what Ricoeur says for each of the different areas: history, action, texts.
Yeah. Can I add on the bottom of 227 where he says there's always a subtle discrepancy between the intentional movement of decision, prospective, and the retrospection through which I tell the story of my motive. That gap is where hermeneutic of suspicion can sort of wedge a knife in between them,
Right.
Can I ask just one question? This is a very minor technical question, but on page 232, Ricoeur refers to, about 10 lines down, Freud, Lawrenson, and others. And I don't know if you followed that. I tried to follow that, but I wonder if that's a mistake. And what he means is, what he meant to say was a reference to Alfred Lorenzer, Lorenzer, who wrote a wonderful book called Sprachzerstörung und Rekonstruktion, about speech and psychoanalysis, and the way in which psychoanalysis is a restoration of the expressive meanings of speech. Is that, am I reading that right? Is to think that that's who he meant, was Lorenzer? Okay, he's a very well-known psychoanalyst in German.
Yeah.
Of that era. I mean, that book came out in 1976.
Right.
Sprachzerstörung, Rekonstruktion. Okay.
I think that must be it.
Yeah. John?
Oh
yeah, John, sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm having a little difficulty with the way Ricoeur talks about, I think, one of the things is mediation. And I don't think Gadamer saw dialogue, or especially dialectic, really as mediation. I think resolving conflict between two people. I don't think that's how Gadamer saw it, because I think he liked to see it in terms of the Platonic model, which was where the logos emerged. That was so it's like a third element that comes from language. So I think that's part of a difference. I don't think, to me, that maybe I'm wrong about this, if somebody can challenge me on this, but I don't, that's my difficulty right now.
Just for clarification, that Gadamer, when he's talking about dialogue, that through the flow of the conversation, the truth wins out.
Yeah. Yes.
Whereas when Ricoeur's talking about mediation, it's like he's trying to combine things.
Yeah, it's reaching an ultimate agreement, and for Gadamer, agreement is not. I mean, it may be very useful in society and very important, but it's not really what philosophy does. Philosophy is always new. It's waiting for the truth to emerge, and like even like in the beginning of the part 3 of Truth and Method, where he says that what a genuine conversation is in the control of neither person, type of thing. I think that's the point he's trying to make, and with the it's the turn to the logoi, and it's where truth comes out for both people. That's yeah. I don't think Ricoeur quite grasps that.
Why do you have to put it? Sorry. Why do you have to put it as Ricoeur doesn't quite grasp that, and just Ricoeur is doing something different?
I don't know. Good question. But I think that's okay. I'll let Jean Quentin can answer that.
Well, I think one of the major differences between Gadamer and Ricoeur, despite all their basic agreement, is that Ricoeur accepts that the starting point of philosophy is the self-reflection of the ego, or the I. That's how he starts his philosophy of the will. And if you go back before that, his early master's thesis on French reflective philosophy also testifies to that. Of course, the I, the ego, is a broken ego, we learned in later works of Ricoeur, so it can only understand itself through the detour of interpretation, but it's basically an attempt to understand, basically an attempt on the part of the ego to understand itself. And I think Gadamer never takes the starting point. In a dialogue, it's not you and me, it's not John Beach and Greg Lynch discussing, and where a mediation would mean you take a bit from John Beach and a bit from Greg Lynch, and you make a synthesis out of that. It is something that is beyond the point of view of the subjects that are discussing. Meaning, the logos will impose itself on the speaker. And I think Gadamer also celebrated that in Heidegger, that he overcame the starting point of modern philosophy in the ego, and the self-reflection of the ego. And that would also be an aspect in the difference between Gadamer's, let's say, starting point in Greek philosophy, and Ricoeur's starting point with the reflective philosophy of someone like Descartes and his innumerable hairs. The ego is never that important for Gadamer. It's perhaps too absent or too self-effaced, or you could argue that, but for Ricoeur, it is the starting point. It is what we are.
Yeah. Just to confirm what you're saying, because I was a little worried with what John Beach was saying, because Gadamer seems at the end so much to say dialogue bridges any form of alienation, brings persons together, as though bringing persons together were the point. But on page 220, he says, and I think this is more typical of him in the middle of the page, that mysterious openness to being, which is inseparably connected with our finitude, okay? It's this openness to being that's the point, and openness to questioning, and openness which lays the constant charge upon our human living to break through the illusions of self-sufficiency. And it's the self-confidence, it's the secure self-consciousness which then deploys a method on objects. And that is what he opposes. Method is always the sign of a secure self-consciousness, and we must break through the illusions of self-sufficiency in order to open ourselves to being. I think that that's where he's going. Okay.
I appreciate what you're saying there, Don, and you know, sometimes I feel like I'm being a recur apologist in this conversation. but okay, so just sticking with that line, right? It's mysterious openness to being, which is inseparably connected to our finitude, and openness to questioning. But I've got to articulate that questioning in some form or other. And if I don't have a sufficiently discrete vocabulary within which to pose my questions, then I'm asking muddy questions rather than questions that can get trapped. They might not be full-fledged a method, right? But in recur, right? Like recur being able to say, like, here's the theory of a text, here's the theory of action, here's a theory of history, here's a theory of psychoanalysis. Now I'm not going to ask psychoanalytic questions in the theory of text because I realize that that's confusing domains of being, within which I'm trying to be open to being. But if I just start to smear everything together, I'm still not open to being. I've got to have a sufficiently discrete, but maybe that's the problem here.
Oh, I think that's very good. Well said.
That recur can help. It doesn't, I think that recur can help rather than be undermining to Gadamer. That recur can actually help with what Gadamer's saying here.
And Gadamer talked about scope before in an earlier discussion. And that was what Gadamer was referring to as scope, I think. Okay.
Well, yeah, because he talks about it's sort of the function of language in Heidegger. You know, that the relation to being. I'm not finding the text right away, but he speaks about this with Heidegger. Okay, it's on page 220. It's up just higher up. Okay, interpretation is not an activity in the course of life, but is the form of life itself. I mean, interpretation is a life activity. It's not just this limited domain of taking a text and then explaining what it means. Thus, we're always projecting. It's the very energy of our life. It's our desires, wishes, hopes. It culminates, and that's what I'm after. It culminates in its expression of an orientation by means of speech. So language is it's sort of like what Wittgenstein says when he says the form of you could live a life such that you would be able to say, I believe there will be an afterlife. You know, and what I will believe there's afterlife means is it's an expression of the form of your life. Okay, and I think that's what Gadamer is kind of saying. So that an interpretation is that it's an expression of your life, not simply a set of statements about a text over against a text to be validated by looking at the text. You know.
Yeah. Okay. So, and maybe this is connected with what you were just saying, but it's complicated. So, just to introduce this, I've been a chair of a department and have been involved in like core curriculum issues and trying to come up with different ways to establish a core curriculum for students, right? And so we came up with this, what I thought was a really interesting strategy, which was have categories like interpret text, investigate nature, create art, right? And so then within that category, you have flexibility among the classes. So it's not just everybody takes history 101, everybody takes philosophy 101. There could be any number of classes that would fulfill that. And so I was tasked with making a standardized assessment for the interpret text category.
Wow.
Okay. And so I'm supposed to create this thing that's across theater, music, comm studies, English, philosophy, religious studies, and so on. And I just propose, here's a simple thing. Can the student identify the thesis statement or plot within this written text? And the response from faculty was, well, I think that dance is a text. I think that video games are a text. And I'm sitting there going, well, okay, in principle, given what Gadamer's saying, I'm kind of along that lines too.
Yeah.
But for a measurable, analysis of student
Right.
capability, I think it's better to go with recur, right? And say it's a written text. Can you do this to a written text? If you can do it to a written text, now you're more than welcome to do it to a tree. But until you can do it to a written text, you're not able to do it. Am I making sense? Right? I was disappointed when I read Gadamer saying by text, I mean anything, or by interpretation, like you were saying, it's an ongoing process of life. It's not just about interpreting text.
Right.
And that would not be helpful in developing an assessment plan for a curriculum.
He says hermeneutics gets him into a lot of trouble because people want a method, and I completely sympathize with you. It's the paradox that if you are required to measure what you teach, then you teach only what you can measure, as though that's all there is, and that's a problem. That's a problem.
So I think I was right. I think Gadamer's argument. So Gadamer is concerned about setting up the distinction between interpretations which integrate us into a tradition and create continuity and create community, and interpretations that unmask, right, and show what's maybe really going on behind the scenes and what is the relation between them. And his conclusion, I think we know, is his argument is going to be that the second kind, the unmasking, always only happens against the background of the first kind. So we only even think to unmask when we're in a situation where certain things have been made intelligible and other things haven't, and certain questions make sense and other ones don't, and certain kind of answers make sense and other ones don't. And it's only against that background, which is the background of the first way, the background of the interpretations which sort of draw connections and create community, that we even have the second way. And I think that's the point of his Heideggerian argument, is to say we need to think about interpretation as fundamentally a description of the way in which we inhabit the world. And this is always a process of making sense of things.
Right.
And once we understand that fundamental level, then the conflict doesn't seem like such a tension between two separate things anymore. The unmasking just becomes one of the ways in which we learn to take up the world. I think that's the argument there. But you could still say there still is a difference between interpreting a written text versus interpreting a tree. I think
I agree with that, as long as it's recognized that background against which you do the unmasking is not a fixed, stable thing. It is something which, as he says on 219, a cultural heritage which forms and transforms itself in a process of mediation. So we can never accept as just self-evident the sort of Christian humanist tradition that preceded the fundamental cultural break marked by the French Revolution. We're just never there again. We'll never be there again. Okay. But I think that's what you're saying,
Right. And I think that sense of mediation is a different sense than what Ricoeur is saying, back to the earlier point. Because I think there's a great book by Alan Schiff about 20th century French philosophy, where he talks about the structure of the academic system in France and the way the tests work and the way they're taught to take these tests in order to get enter into these programs. And it's all based on the dialectic. All your answers have to be based on a dialectic where you set two sides against each other and then you find the middle ground. And I that always strikes me as the model for Ricoeur, raised in this sort of intellectual environment. The game is always I'm gonna stake out the middle ground of the dialect and say they've gone too far and they've gone too far and I'm in the middle ground. And I think that's his model of mediation as well. Where Gadamer, I think it's something different. It is the event, like John said, it's the event of tradition being carried on in a new way through you, or the event of the meaning of the text coming to reveal something new through you.
Good. Can I refer to page 222 here, because I think this is he gives 3 or 4 statements where he says interpretation is. It looked like a definition. Okay, in the course of this discussion, which I think are very important. But here he says toward the middle, interpretation is, this is Heidegger's insight, interpretation is not a sovereign attitude over against a pre-established context of meaning so that I can decipher it and possess it exhaustively and definitively. Okay? So that's not what it is. So in a sense, unmasking is our friend because it unsettles the way we read text. It doesn't allow us just to read them on the surface and take them for granted. But I think if it doesn't seem impertinent or something, I think he thinks they really don't quite go far enough. They really miss the depth of what is going on, because in fact, there's always interpretation, he says here, is an ongoing process of life in which there is always something behind and something expressly intended. Both an opening of a horizon and a concealing of something take place in all our experiences of interpretation. This is the paradox of the hermeneutics of facticity, because facticity is unintelligible, it's opaque. Okay, and that's always true. There's always something opaque. There's always something concealed in every interpretation. Yeah.
And that affects, right, like if you keep going on the page, that affects, he has to think about dialogue, right? Because dialogue is itself, it's not, just like you were saying, interpretation is not this person has a sovereign attitude over pre-established meanings, just like a dialogue is not, you already know what you're talking about, that these are these fixed ideas and just convincing the other person is the point. Instead, this interplay between the two persons is this constant, right? The unconcealing while something else is being concealed. So the dialogue will always progress as this interplay of concealing and opening.
Right. Yeah.
Yep, I think that makes sense.
And that's what he means by dialogue, which makes it a limited thing. I mean, I was trying to think this morning about this. You know, there's a communication going on in a court of law in a criminal case. But you wouldn't call it a dialogue. And because it's not a dialogue, there are a lot of special rules that we impose to hedge it around. There's things you can't ask the defendant. You can't make him say things. You know, there's certain rules about how you proceed. Those don't apply to dialogue, because dialogue is that kind of being with another person in which, by being together and interchanging, one opens oneself to being. That's what it is. And that is even more than just, I say some words, you say some words, I say some words, you say some words. You know?
Yeah. John.
Yeah, and this is great. This reminds me again of, it's often misunderstood, for Gadamer, for dialogue to begin, in order not to be a talking across purposes, there has to be a homologia. There has to be a point of agreement. But that's only the beginning. And so it doesn't come out really clearly here, and I think it's pertinent to our general discussion. It's not mediation that we're talking about with Gadamer.
Yeah.
John, when you say a point of agreement, you know, I'm thinking of the spaces in Truth and Method where Gadamer's talking about like translation versus interpretation and the kind of overlap between them, but also two people from two different languages are trying to communicate. One language comes to dominate. But is the point of agreement that sets off a dialogue, isn't that merely the agreement that we're going to use these terms this way, not agreement that we agree that what you're saying is true? Right? Is the agreement on a common language, like we're going to speak in these terms together, or is the agreement that we come to share beliefs?
Well, it's sort of, it's not an agreement on language or a definition or anything like that. To me, like I've got Plato's dialogues in my mind now, and it comes up when, after Socrates drives everybody crazy for the first half of the dialogue, and you think, well, what is this guy doing? He's not, and then it sort of emerges that there is a point, and then it's Socrates, and yes, Socrates, yes, that's true, that's right, that's true, and they start going, it takes off, and it's sort of like something that comes up accidentally. It sort of emerges. They just find themselves, they're looking for solid ground, and they can't, because they keep finding objections. Well, that doesn't work, and this doesn't work, and that doesn't work. And then they finally find something that emerges that they can coalesce around. And there's no longer, I mean, they haven't got to the problem, they haven't solved the answer to the question, but it's a way that they can begin to elaborate and develop the question, and the dialectic can unfold.
I think you're being selective with what you're choosing from Plato, because at other times, you know, like think of in the Republic when he's arguing with Thrasymachus about, you know, you're using the term virtue to talk about, you know, manipulation. That's not how we ordinarily use the word virtue. Can we come to settle on the terms so that we can actually start talking, because you're using the terms in a way that I wouldn't use them.
Well, yeah, the reason, I mean, I remember once Gadamer saying that anyone who begins a discussion by defining his terms, you know, they're an amateur. So what I'm trying to say is that, you know, we don't want to narrow it down to that, but that's, I mean, I agree that plays a role, and there's
I think that's all Ricoeur does, is define his terms before he gets started. That's funny. Yeah. Oh man.
No. Greg Lynch, you want to get in here, Greg?
Great.
Yeah, I was just going to say to that question you were asking, Nathan, Wittgenstein's got a line where he says something like, understanding requires agreement, not just in language, but also, strange as it may sound, in judgments. And Gadamer cites that somewhere and agrees with it, says, yes, Wittgenstein's exactly right about this. And I think the idea is that even before we can agree on, okay, by the term justice, let's mean X, we have to have, you know, agreement about a whole host of things about, you know, what kind of critters human beings are and how we relate to others around us, and the fact that we live, like, you've got to be, as Davidson says at one point, you've got to agree about a ton of stuff to even be in a position to disagree about anything. And so, yeah, I think it's that kind of background agreement of a at least largely shared kind of orientation to the world that that Gadamer's talking about.
Yeah. I thought of Wittgenstein's remark, if lions could speak, we couldn't understand them. We just don't share the world with lions.
Yeah, exactly. You know, for precisely that reason.
Yeah. And I think that's Gadamer's version of this is there is no first word. A language can't be one word. It isn't also just the vocabulary of the language. It's everything the language says. I mean, it's the infinity of language and what it can express that has to be there from the first word, you know, so, yeah.
And I just to defend myself here, at the bottom of page 22, the second last paragraph, whereas if we find no common point, then we're talking at cross purposes. Mm-hmm. And this is the this is why I think that Ricoeur and Gadamer to a large extent are talking at cross purposes, because they don't it's a different ontology they're working out of, like, and Gadamer's working out of a non-Cartesian ontology, whereas Ricoeur is Cartesian.
John, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you. I'm just kind of dialectically with you.
Right.
Fair enough. Absolutely.
Because then again, right, like I get the kind of analogy with Wittgenstein and this sort of stuff too, but let's go back to the bottom of 222. Finding a common language is not contributing to a new handbook of science or thought. It's sharing a social act. Right, that it's the common terms, not necessarily the shared judgments that is generative of this possibility for, right? Like Cynthia was bringing up, like, do we create solidarity, or is solidarity something that we already have, right? Like, and yes, in some senses, solidarity is something we already have in order to even touch off disagreements, because how could we disagree if we're so alien to one another that we don't even recognize each other as possible dialogue partners, right? So there's the shared judgment in that kind of framework, but then there's the disagreement that we have, where to be able to make sure that we can argue against or for the sides of the disagreement, we first got to make sure that we're even using words consistently and not equivocating or something like this. So,
Yes,
so
but
like it's going back and forth between this continuum of shared judgment, shared language, shared judgment.
Yeah, we just, with Gadamer though, because everything comes out of language itself, we got to be careful not to use language as a tool or start to fix it or try to rigidify it and let it tell us. Like, that's all I'm concerned with, basically.
Was Jean going to say something?
No, it was just a comment about the lions. I would disagree. If lions could speak, we could understand them because it would be language. As long as there is a spoken word or a language, it is something we can understand. That is Gadamer's thesis. And indeed, we do understand lions. Imagine you're in the middle of a jungle somewhere, and then a lion stares at you and starts smiling. You understand, oh, this lion wants to eat me. And that's a perfect understanding of a lion. That's what the lion has in mind. So we can understand lions. We can understand other people. Understanding is always possible. In this, Gadamer is very different from Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein has this idea that language games are homogeneous. You have to be into this language game order to understand it and so forth. But as Habermas understood very clearly, Gadamer goes beyond this idea by saying that as long as there is language, it is something that can be understood. So we do understand lions.
Yeah.
Even if they don't speak. But if they would be speaking, we would understand them.
Right. So being that can be understood is language.
Yes, definitely.
As
long as there is a language that is spoken. I mean, somebody can speak a foreign language that you don't understand, but it is always possible to understand.
Right. I'm a little terrified that there's so many people here and so many of them are not speaking. Are they secretly thinking I'm an idiot and they just don't want to talk to me or something, or what's? I don't want to put people on the spot, but
they did not want to tell you.
We feel like you did at this conference with Ricoeur and Gadamer, in awe of the authors. That's how I feel.
Oh,
so
no.
I just am.
Bless your heart, Kate. Anyway.
So there's here's a question that can hopefully bring more people in, because it's a great example. One of the questioners, not Don, but one of the other questioners there mentioned a variety of interpretations of Beethoven, right? Different conductors will have different interpretations. And is this an example of a conflict of interpretations? And Gadamer says, no, this is not a conflict. This is, he picked another word. He called it now I lost my page.
Competition.
A competition of interpretations, right. But then he goes on to say that nevertheless, an interpreter of, if we sort of listen to he has 10 side by side, different things will appear to us, and we'll realize some of them do things better than others. And this doesn't render us incapable of still saying that some of these conductors' interpretation of Beethoven are better than others.
Right. In
the end, my inner ear then feels superior to any given performance, right? Even though I'm not a conductor, right? I don't have the sort of expertise they have. I still can listen to these, and my inner ear will tell me, yeah, Solti's the one who got it right. Is that a surprising way to go? See, that's an example I think everyone can start to grab onto and think about. My hope is that will bring more people in. Gadamer wants to say that our inner ear is superior to any given performance.
Well, if nobody's going to do it,
John had his hand up.
John, you have a hand in the screen there. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, I don't want to speak too much either. But I would say this example of Beethoven confirms to me that Gadamer did not get in this dialogue what the conflict of interpretation is all about for Ricoeur. The conflict of interpretation for Ricoeur, what is it? It is basically the idea that you have two totally different approaches to interpretation. On the one hand, you have the school of suspicion, the Freuds, the Marx, the structuralists, and on the other hand, you have the school of what is the opposite of suspicion, the
recovery,
recovery, whatever, Vertrauen, and so forth. This is the conflict of interpretations, and it's true. I mean, either you interpret a text at face value, or you interpret the text by thinking that there is some hidden motive behind it. That was the conflict of interpretation for Ricoeur. But the example of Beethoven is misguided because it goes without saying that every dirigent, everyone will direct a symphony of Beethoven differently. Salty will not direct the symphony the same way as Karajan or whoever, because the piece is meant to be interpreted in the musical sense, of course, differently. But that is not at all the conflict of interpretation Ricoeur was talking about. And I think Gadamer never got that. But of course, I mean, there is no one way of interpreting a symphony of Beethoven. There are basic guidelines. I mean, you have to play the notes and so forth. But
yeah, the different interpreters are not claiming that here Beethoven is living out the Oedipal complex.
Right.
Both trying to perform it well.
So that there's no such thing as the diametrical conflict of interpretations Ricoeur is talking about.
Right. But what Gadamer is after there is the sort of dialectic of the one and the many. Because even though there are many interpretations of Beethoven, there aren't many Beethovens. You know, there is this symphony by Beethoven, and they are all interpretations of it, even though the symphony by Beethoven, which is the one, will never be realized except in an interpretation. Okay, so, but there's something in my inner ear that still rises superior and says, well, this part of Solti is better, that part of Karajan is better. There's something there. This is the logos. This is the musical equivalent of the logos. This is the musical equivalent of being coming through, even though no individual ever captures that in what he says. Yeah.
The questioner does set up two options, and Gadamer goes toward one of them. The questioner says, "Is this a problem that there are multiple versions, or should we just say let 1,000 flowers bloom? This is great. We've got all this variety. We should embrace the diversity." And Gadamer says, "No, we're drawn toward. It's a competition, right?" He could use other words there, but it's a competition, and our inner ear always draws us toward thinking one of them is better than the other in this way or that way.
Interesting.
So that's where I wanted to say, it does seem like a pretty reasonable response to say, there are so many, to look at all the things you can do with Beethoven, including things that sound crazy or terrible to my uneducated ear, but maybe they're fascinating. And Gadamer wants to say, no, we're always in a kind of evaluative mode. We're always going to be thinking about what's good about this and not good about this. And so we're always going to be seeing these things as, we're never quite sit still with, oh yes, and here's another one, and here's a different version. We're always asking about an interpretation. Why is this better or worse than the other ones that have been passed down to us? An interpretation of Plato. What does this do well for Plato and not, and how does it then, is it then better than worse than the ones that we have in front of us? Does that sound right? William, you're in.
Yes, hello. I was just wanting to follow up with the idea of the inner ear, because in the Relevance of the Beautiful, I just have in front of me, like he talks about how the ideal creation only arises insofar as we ourselves actively transcend all contingent aspects. So there's this sort of noetic sense, in some sense we seem to experience there. And I just wanted to bring that out if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, say that one more time. I need to hear that one more time.
Okay. okay, he says the ideal creation only arises insofar as we ourselves actively transcend all contingent aspects. Yeah, and this is in a section in Relevance to the Beautiful where he's talking about the inner ear. So.
You think he's saying that the ideal creation doesn't exist then? Or is he think he's saying in order for this to happen, we've managed to transcend all these?
I mean, it does. I mean, there's a sense of moving past the contingent. So it's to me, it's moving in some kind of noetic direction. And in this case, he seems to think that resolves the competition of interpretations to some extent. And I guess it's a question of what exactly he's meaning by that. Is he discovering something? Is he creating something? Or some combination of the two? Yeah.
Good question. I'm muted. There you go, John. I was muted. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, if you're going to respond to William, go.
Yes, no, thank you, William. I would say our inner ear is always hearing what is said. So there is no such thing for Gadamer, contrary to what one reads often, as an equivalence of interpretations. Not all interpretations are equal. Some are better than others. This is why in his in the musical case, Gadamer would say, we will find one interpretation more appealing, better, or more accurate than the other. We are always involved. There is something in Gadamer that always resisted this idea that you have many different interpretations and there's nothing but interpretations and we have to accept them and so forth. We are always involved. We're always in the middle of interpreting through our inner ear. Things go through our head. That's we listen and it goes through our head. That's the inner ear. I mean, there's also a medical notion of the inner ear if you want, but it is understood here in a metaphorical sense. So this is how I would understand it. We are always attuned to the truth, the meaning. There's no equivalence of interpretations, contrary to what often reads about Gadamer.
Because if we could go back up into the text, like I think earlier on, someone asked a question about it's about related to an onion or the question or the answer. And he says, we can't get to the core of the onion. But to me, that's not really that interesting question. Like, can we get to level 2 or 3, or can we get enough to resolve the competition of interpretations? And like, I would agree with you, there's something in there with Gadamer about the truth. And sometimes I think the way he puts it, like we can't get to the core, isn't necessarily totally helpful because it sort of misses the point that you can at least get to a proximity, maybe a productive proximity.
Right. It's almost like a bit of a straw man. No one's trying to get to the core.
Yeah.
Right? There's all sorts of things we could be doing other than just getting to the core. That could be productive and helpful. Yeah.
This is where I think
Eric,
Gadamer.
You've been waiting.
This is where I think Gadamer is he performs the dialogical way of kind of even in his speeches, right? That whereas I don't think Ricoeur writes in a dialogical way because I'm hearing Gadamer, right? Like earlier we were talking about how Gadamer doesn't objectify text, he doesn't objectify interpretation, but then if you can say one interpretation is better than the other interpretation, and we can evaluate it in terms of our inner ear, he's just used interpretation in a second way than when he was using it earlier with what we were talking about with Don. And so that's where I think like Ricoeur can come in and say, well, okay, that's one thing to say our inner ear determines our ability to notice whether one interpretation is more compelling than another, but that's not going to be very helpful in a classroom when I have two students that are saying, I have a better inner ear than you, right? It's like, okay, prove it. Well, you're going to prove it in terms of some analytic, some sort of model, some sort of structure where you can actually, determine the specifics about why is this interpretation better than another? Well, because it explains more than the other interpretation does, or something like that. It doesn't, right? It incorporates explanation or something like that. But that's where, the inner ear can be susceptible to it's. I mean, we were talking about Cartesianism earlier. it seems like the inner ear appeal can be susceptible to beauty is in the eye of the beholder relativism level emotionalism, right? The subjectivization of aesthetics that he's worried about at the beginning of Truth and Method, that's where my college students are, the traditional students are going to start running with, well, since it's inner ear, I know that this is a superior interpretation, and you can't be objective about this.
Niall, come join us.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's really hot here. I'm having difficulty concentrating and articulating a question, so this might not be so clear. But I thought one of the maybe missing voices here would be, I think Jean was pointing to it by talking about philosophers of reflection a little bit. And I think one of Ricoeur's teachers is Jean Nabert. So Nabert, as an influence on Ricoeur, which connects to the earlier point of is it Cartesian? Is Ricoeur more Cartesian than Gadamer? I think he is more Cartesian than Gadamer, but I would be loath to say he's Cartesian, because he takes from Nabert this idea that philosophy of reflection must be undergone to actually, what he says in the conflict of interpretation, to explode the cogito, right? So what he wants to do is explode Husserl's cogito, but that must be done by way of reflection. I think Gadamer doesn't feel he needs to go that route. I think Gadamer, you're right, Jean is right. Gadamer tries to follow Heidegger to almost change track altogether. Well, Gadamer will stay closer to the tradition maybe than Heidegger does in terms of his being with the past, and where Heidegger is trying to break. I think with Ricoeur, it's almost the only way we can break with it or critique it is by way of a different concept of reflection, which undoes the dominance of the cogito. I think Gadamer, so I'm not saying anything different, actually. I'm just saying I think he gets that from Nabert, specifically the concept of failure, actually, this idea that reflection or the cogito can never fully apprehend itself, where Husserl thinks that the cogito can apprehend itself in principle, right? It can in principle grasp itself. And I think he takes from Nabert this idea that it will always fail to do so, but only by way of reflection can we break with this kind of the fantasy of absolute self-transparency. So I just that's more of a comment than a question.
Okay. William, do you still have your point?
Sure. I guess I was still trying to work with the idea of the inner ear, and going back to John was bringing up the importance of the logos and the Platonism, and to me it reads a little bit like almost moving from, say, the competition of interpretations, a little bit like the opinions of interpretation, and then moving to a bit of knowledge, in a sense, a little bit, if you wanted to use the cave, stepping out of the cave, Plato's cave, seeing a bit more insight through something like the inner ear. And I was wanting to, if anyone had any comments about that, because again, there's that sense to me moving in a noetic direction, like when he's talking about moving past the contingencies, there's this sense of almost a purifying, in a sense. Maybe it's not going to be a complete purification, but there is a sense of experiencing the thing itself, or whatever it would be, in a more pure sense. Just wanted to bring that up.
John is on this topic. John Beach, you have to unmute yourself to answer yes or no.
You're muted, John.
John Beach, I'll ask you to unmute a few times here.
Yes, sorry.
There you are.
Yes, it is on this question. And
Okay.
but very briefly, I do think that when I hear one talking about the inner ear, I try to grasp what Gadamer keeps talking about. We need to have the inner ear for a word, for language, for the meaning of a word. And that's of course, we have to recall that for Gadamer, ultimately it is language that's at the bottom of his ontology, if one can, the ground, if one can, we speak to that. And so I think that that's all I wanted to say, just connect it to language, the inner ear.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And hearing what language tells us.
Greg, are you in? Are you on this topic?
Yeah. Just building off what John just said, I take it that when Gadamer talks about hearing with the inner ear, he's talking about hearing the music not just as a string of sounds, but as a musical work, which means hearing it as a kind of artistic unity. And so when he's talking about, our inner ear will judge what was done better than others, it's that we've got this sense of kind of the work as a unity, and we're going to recognize different performances as having kind of realized that unity better or less well than other ones did. So it's not as much about the inner ear is not about like my subjective taste or personal preference or anything like that. It's similar to the difference between hearing words as a string of sounds and hearing them as expressing a coherent unified meaning. It's like the musical analog of that.
That makes sense. I think there's a sense in which you do have this. You could say, well, I just liked it better. I don't know why. But ideally, you'd be able to explain your reasons. Maybe you say something. I'm trying to think of examples. Like say, well, the brass was too overpowering, so I really didn't have the sense of a conversation going back and forth between the brass and the woodwinds, or something like this, where you actually are trying to give reasons
Mm-hmm.
that picks out what really makes the piece great, right? So it's always then you might say the truth of the piece, right? It always goes beyond just the experience to try to capture what the experience is trying to. Maybe it's what Beethoven was trying to do, or just maybe it's what the symphony does, whether Beethoven is trying to or not. It shows this great sort of back and forth, the way the motif plays through different sections, and if a section is too weak, you lose it and it gets dropped when it goes through, or something like this.
Mm-hmm.
And that way, it seems that we've moved beyond just the mere experience toward then we've almost got a criteria for other versions. We can say, well, if you think that, you must really hate this person's, right? Something, and now we've moved beyond mere subjective, I like it or I don't, towards something that seems more transcendent. Is that the right word in this context? But at least it seems like you're trying to get at something that's more universal about what makes it a quality performance. I jumped in on you, Eric. Go ahead, Eric. You had your hand
No,
up.
that's okay. What you were saying was perfect. And just to add to that, I remember in is it Text and Interpretation, in his dialogue with Derrida, where he's talking about reading and how when you read, there's a recitation quality to it, and so like you got to bring the sound and the meaning come out together. And so I always think of Quranic recitation competitions, where right. It's like American Idol. Like if you can recite the Quran better than somebody else, everybody else recognizes that you're able to capture the resonance of the voice of God, right? Like this is that's setting standards for new interpretation. But this gets to like what I wanted to bring up is this connection or difference that you brought up originally, David, between or was it Don, the competition versus conflict of interpretation.
Yeah, got it.
The competition is the one that lends to this kind of, this is a better interpretation, or this gets at more, the brass is just right, like you were saying. Whereas the conflict, that's why I think Ricoeur kind of has this Christian apologetics behind kind of his projects, because in a way he's trying to rescue reading like the Hebrew Bible or whatever and say we can read this in a religious way, or at least in a Boltzmann sort of way. And but Marxists and Freudian and Nietzschean interpretations of it want to make it just about power, want to make it just about economics, and that undermines its religious capacity for saving me, right? It's no longer good news if it's just a text that is a function of a psychoanalytic set of dysfunctions. And so, right, that's the conflict that Gadamer doesn't even address with the competition, because it doesn't seem like a Freudian reading of, to me, this happened with Ganesh in Hinduism. There's this guy, Paul Courtwright, I think he was at Emory. He wrote a book and he mentions like you could do an interesting Freudian analysis of Ganesh, the elephant trunk god, like saying it's a phallic symbol or whatever. and he gets death threats from Hindu Dav, right? The radical fundamentalist Hindus, right? Because that's the conflict of interpretation that Ricoeur is trying to get at. It's like religious fundamentalists versus radical secularists, and that's leading to like murderous level conflict here. That's not just, oh yeah, the Freudian analysis of Ganesh. Now that's a better, that fits my inner ear better than, you know,
right,
sacrificing a goat to Ganesh or pouring milk on the statue or whatever, right?
I think that's a good example, and I find it very moving because this kind of murderous conflict of interpretation is all around us. So I don't know what Gadamer would have to say about this, but even the competition of interpretations, I think that's good. And I completely agree with Jean Gaudin that this is the way in which an interpretation can be better. One can be better than another without having to fall back on a claim of a method that validates the correct interpretation. So that, you know, the better interpretation is the correct one and the others are incorrect. That's not what Gadamer would want to say, because we have the experience of finding one interpretation compelling at a certain point in our life, and later on finding a different interpretation of the same piece compelling. So it is embedded in the ongoing processes of our individual and social lives. It's not removed to a realm of correct validation according to a method, as long as we get there. Okay.
I just saw a comment by Cynthia Nielsen that I think is really good, and it's like jazz. Like there's, I think the interpretation that speaks to us. I mean, this is not what Cynthia says, but we should read what she said. But it's what most powerfully speaks to us, that brings it, that resolves, and that gives us the greatest feeling. That's all that we know. We can't tell, you know, we can't say, you know, put them on a rating system. Really doesn't mean a lot. You know, that's not what art, you know, that's not what's really important, I think, in music. And I think Gadamer's point might be that it's not a, you know, objectifying which is better, which is closer, which is, you know, that's not really the point of it. I don't know if that makes any sense or if that adds anything, but I just wanted to add that.
Is it possible for anyone to ever feel that way about the kinds of interpretive models? And maybe this is Gadamer's point, that psychoanalysis, Nietzschean interpretation, Marxism, all these, what Ricoeur's calling hermeneutics of suspicion, maybe Gadamer just doesn't think that is interpretation then. Because could there ever be a Freudian interpretation of a religious book or a work of art or whatever, where you're like, yeah, now that gets the truth of, that really fits my inner ear of what I thought was going on here?
Are you asking me? Well, I think that to me, like Freud, like he's into one of these reductionist sort of worldviews that Gadamer would not want to really adhere to. And so, but I mean, Freud may have very interesting and very great things to say, but this is not philosophy as Gadamer would see it. That's my answer. I don't know if it means what it means, but that's my answer.
Great. I would say Freud is pretty good when he speaks about the unconscious, but when he tries to interpret Leonardo da Vinci, maybe he's not the best interpreter for Gadamer.
Let me just say, Greg, and then you're up, that Gadamer does have the example of Frederick II and the Silesian Wars. And he refers to Frederick II as a special kind of man. And Frederick II was known for having male lovers when he was young. One of them was beheaded in front of him because his father was so upset about him having male lovers. And I imagine there are theories about Frederick II's role as Frederick the Great, uh, given his sexual orientation, and given that it was the middle of the 19th century. So I think Gadamer is suggesting these kinds of interpretations explicitly in the paragraph in 236, but also saying that it's never enough to just simply appeal to these sorts of individual personality traits. Greg.
Yeah, and just I think in keeping with that, and Gadamer says, I can't find it in front of me right now, but he says somewhere in there that these kind of suspicious interpretations. Oh, sorry, my son just came in and is deeply displeased here.
Happy
These
Father's
kind of
Day.
suspicious interpretations they're what we fall back on when the charitable interpretation proves impossible, right? Because what we're
Yes.
always going for when we're
Yes.
interpreting something is for it to say something to us, for it to have something to teach us. And that's precisely what the hermeneutics of suspicion doesn't do, right? It says, no, there's not this isn't telling us something, it's betraying something that's kind of going on behind the scenes. So there may be cases in which the best interpretation we can give of a thing is a Marxist interpretation or a Freudian interpretation or whatever. But that's only going to be when there are no kind of charitable interpretations there to be had. So yeah, I think that would be his take on that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it has to be said that you start with the Freudian interpretation from Freud, and then another psychoanalyst produces an interpretation, and another one produces an interpretation, another one produces an interpretation. Pretty soon we have the same structure of competing psychoanalytic interpretations, and some seem to respond better to the thing being analyzed and some less good. So we think somebody has a simplistic psychoanalytic view and someone has a subtle psychoanalytic view. It just, when it actually gets going as a process of interpretation, it isn't that there is the psychoanalytic interpretation. It begins to proliferate in the way all human life does. Yeah.
I just was thinking that maybe we're drifting away here from what is philosophy is to interpret the whole. And this is metaphysics, and this is why we interpret philosophical texts. And here we're looking at sort of modern, sort of theoretical ways of semi-scientific ways of grasping various objects or various things or various phenomena, which are all very valid, which all have their role and all have their place. But I think that's not what really drives Gadamer's is not looking for a wonder working, hermeneutics as a like it's the whole, and that's why the historical, the traditional text is what really lies at the center, I think, of Gadamer's understanding of hermeneutics.
Maybe that's where there's this divergence because that's what I was thinking. Ricoeur might not be as concerned about making sure that what he's doing is always philosophical, because even talking, he's more than happy to talk about Clifford Geertz, and Geertz doesn't walk around saying I'm a philosopher. Geertz explicitly identifies as an anthropologist, right? And Ricoeur is trying to participate in conversations about film. He's trying to participate in conversations about literary criticism, biblical criticism. He's more than happy to speak in the language of those different fields. And I think that's where the conflict of interpretations really occurs, right? Because it's, for me, I'm thinking of a religious studies department where you look at the field of religious studies, it's conflicted between secularists and people who are explicitly religious. Can a non-Buddhist or a non-Muslim teach a course on Islam or Buddhism? And there's literally people think that you can't, you can't really understand Islam unless you're Muslim. It's well, if we use Ricoeur's method, does that get us close enough to understanding it? What is, yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is, you wouldn't, you know, a brain surgeon doesn't necessarily have had to have a brain tumor, right? So
Right.
I guess I don't quite agree with.
But you can't convince you, right? Like, so this is where like life threats come in, because people who are undergoing brain surgery are probably less likely to mobilize as an entire community and try to assassinate that person. Whereas at the University of Iowa, speaking of Iowa, Don Marshall, there was a professor of Islam who was given death threats by them. And I don't like the stereotype of Muslims, because I think Hindus do it, I think Christians do it, Buddhists do it, right?
Okay.
Like, they're getting death threats from the Muslim Student Association. This woman should not be teaching Islam in the classroom, because they're not teaching true Islam.
Right.
This happens with Christianity too, right? Like, you get death threats if you don't do it right. I don't know. I'm not trying to argue with you, Nancy, just trying to enhance the complication that comes up with religion in particular, I think.
So I think I think there's, for Ricoeur at least, there's a clear difference between these kinds of interpretations, these kind of interpretive practices. The ones that are asking, ones that are taking it seriously and are meant to sort of unveil the truth of it, and others that are meant to show the ways in which it has been shaped by its historical context or a psychoanalytic background. I don't know that those are so split for Gadamer. I would just say it that way. But I'm also not sure I agree with Greg that you only do the second kind when the first kind fails. I mean, I was thinking about, I was just teaching Hobbes, and I think there's something really valuable in Hobbes in saying this is only a kind of theory someone could come up with who's a man working in the political world, who doesn't have any children, has no real personal connection to raising children, and the idea of this nurturing vulnerability that everyone just does a social contract as an adult. Something like that, you know? That's not a psychoanalytic, that's just simply saying his theory reflects his times and his experience, and the fact that he's a guy and has certain experiences because he's a guy, and that actually helps to understand what's going on too as well. So the more surprising things he says about human beings, you can say, oh, well, of course he would say something like that. What more does he know about it than that?
Yeah.
So but even there, David, you only say that because what he says isn't true, right? Or at least it strikes you as untrue. So he said this untrue thing that there seems to be lots of good reason not to have said. How could he have said this untrue thing? And if you can't come up with like, you know, a reason that would show why, in fact, what he's saying is true, which I agree is the case with Hobbes, that's precisely when you fall back on, well, okay, but there's an explanation for why he said this false thing that he did, and it's because his experiences were limited in this, that, and the other way. But sure. I think that if there's an interpretation of Hobbes that could show, no, look, here's what he really means, and what he's saying is actually correct, right. That's going to be kind of de facto a better interpretation than one that falls back on, well, he just said this because, you know, he was limited in these particular ways.
But I also can use that to motivate me to look for other things in Hobbes that maybe I thought initially were right. Where I say, oh yeah, you know, there's a reason that Hobbes and I both thought that was right, being men. Right? So, I mean, so there's certain things we thought, well, why is he saying something like that? Oh, it makes sense. Well, what else makes sense given that's where he's coming from? And that becomes sort of a critical vehicle then for me to read the text and understand what I should accept or not.
Right. Could it work the other way too? That is, could you look at someone and say, well, he has other reasons for saying these things, like, for instance, right, he's a Nazi, and therefore we should not pay attention to his philosophical remarks, even though they seem to be true or insightful, because really we know that back of them is this very ugly thought.
Right. Well, we also could say, which of these views seem like the kind of thing someone who's a Nazi might start to think? Yes, if they started to do philosophical work in a way that hides their political views.
Yeah.
But no, I know what we're saying here, right? But we're running out of time. This is a sort of a terrible way to end, I think. I think we started with these great stories about Ricoeur and Gadamer and these three men, and we end up talking about Heidegger. And
When you play the Nazi card, you've lost the argument.
Okay.
That's true. That's true.
That's right.
All right. Well, I mean, I guess that's the last word. Thanks, Eric. There's still the list of texts I had before as possible follow-ups. It's a piece that Cynthia recently translated, came up with a very early piece, a radio lecture from 1952 called "The Task of Philosophy in the Present Age." I suggested aesthetics and hermeneutics as sort of, a core Gadamer text. That's always sort of a good option, is just sort of pick a classic core text and read it and talk about it. Coming out in the next volume of Gadamer essays from Paul van de Velde and Arun Iyer are two translations of Bouw Goethe that haven't been translated before. They're both in the Gesammelwerke, but they haven't been translated. And there's another talk from those South African talks that we started with way back at the beginning. So those are always options. I know I'm going to University of Iowa. Maybe I can photocopy some transcriptions, and that could be down the line too. Some secret talks. What year was that? Do you remember, Don? Because I'm probably gonna have to contact them and ask the people.
It's roughly, what would it be? It would be the 1980s.
72, I think.
It'd be later than that. The 80s.
It's later.
Because
It's
I
later
was
than
there.
that. Well, I didn't
Yeah.
get to Iowa until 75, but I think it was like 82, 83, something like that.
Okay.
He came, so it was after this. I also mentioned
Yeah.
an essay called "Historical Transformations of Reason." This is Jean Grodin had mentioned this rationality conference and volume, Rationality Today.
Right.
I don't know if Ricoeur has a piece in that too. I assume he does.
He does.
Yeah.
They
and
both have
then-
pieces, and they both discuss with one another in this volume.
Good. So that would be a continuation of this theme, Gadamer and Ricoeur.
But all the suggestions are good. I mean, I'm happy to read whatever people want to read.
I will add that to the list and send them around. And it'll be mid-August is when we would meet again.
Yeah.
So I'll look at the dates
Yes.
and send a follow-up email, and I'll post the recording online, and so you can relive this over and over again. Any final thoughts? All right. Well, then, thanks everybody. Thanks everyone who came.
Yeah. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Wow.
Bye.